Have you ever wondered why there's so much division due to identity politics in America? We introduce you to the mastermind behind all of it. Meet Antonio Gramsci. Say hello, Antonio.
Ciao.
Antonio was a radical protege of communist philosopher Karl Marx.
Greetings.
Only, instead of jumping on board Marx's method of pushing a fast-paced revolution to communize the world,
Workers of the world unite.
Antonio had a very different plan. He believed that a globalized communist state can only be accomplished through a slow, determined march throughout history, a march that infiltrates and controls every facet of civilization. Gramsci understood that in order to dominate the world with communism, communist leaders would have to be put in charge. He understood that the way to shape popular opinion was through the arts, organizations, and the institutions, all working together to delegitimize a Judeo-Christian Western civilization, and in its place, validate a totalitarian Marxist civilization.
In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture through the infiltration of schools, universities, churches and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity.
First up on the list of institutions that Gramsci said must be infiltrated are the public schools.
Number of football games all across Middle Tennessee tonight likely began with a prayer, but the ACLU wants to see that Southern tradition come to an end.
The organization says too many schools are violating the First Amendment with this pregame prayer.
Many public schools aim to weaken the image of God in their young students' minds by raising doubt in the biblical account of how God created the earth in only 6 days. The idea behind this is that if people don't trust God, then they won't trust in His principles either. Listen to this argument against Christianity and the biblical creation account by public school science sensation Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Would it be your opinion
really
then, and again,
troubling.
I'm just trying to extrapolate what you're saying here, that maybe the evangelics, who you will, those who believe in creationism, that maybe they are keeping their kids from becoming smarter than they could be, keeping them down, keeping them less intelligent?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. No, they're holding the kids back. These kids will not be able to participate in the future in the same way that kids from other school systems, New York, Maryland, exotic places like that.
One last example of how secular socialists are infiltrating public schools is in their agenda to blur the line between male and female, indoctrinating students into believing that gender is merely an identity.
Public schools in Fairfax County, Virginia are preparing to include gender identity in its curriculum for grades 7 through 12. The family life education lessons will include teachings on heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, and transgender identity.
I would feel comfortable with them going into the bathroom because obviously they think that they're female and I'm female, so they wouldn't harm me.
Also on the list of Gramsci's institutions to infiltrate are colleges and universities. While universities should be a place where students can discuss, debate, and examine ideas thoughtfully, they have instead become a hotbed for liberal indoctrination and domination, where professors and students demand that their ideas be heard on one hand, while on the other hand, designating so-called safe spaces for themselves as bunkers to go to whenever someone with opposing ideas speak on campus. It is true that many socialist-minded professors use their classrooms as a platform to infuse animosity in the minds of their students as a means of organizing a generation of angry liberal agitators.
White privilege is a form of an unearned advantage for white people.
Next up is Gramsci's infiltration of the media. Most Americans are aware of the fact that most mainstream news platforms lean left, but there are also many who do not realize the influence that the other encompassing parts of media have on society, namely music and television. Celebrities are so exalted as gods among men in American culture that they are effectively able to drive the narrative by using music and television as a kind of socialist propaganda. Many of the minds behind American media use the industry as a platform to normalize ideas and behaviors that are traditionally viewed as abnormal. It's no secret that Hollywood has an agenda to advance the socialist ideas of the Democrat Party. Hollywood elites showed up in droves for presidential candidates Barack Obama in 2008
Obama, 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 Obama,
and Hillary Clinton in 2016, using their influence to organize their fan base.
But you only get this many famous people together if the issue's
one that truly matters to all of us.
A disease or
ecological crisis or
a racist, abusive coward who could permanently damage the fabric of our society.
Lastly, Gramsci believed that socialism must infiltrate the church. It is important to understand that many churches in America are spiritually healthy and Christ-centered. On the other hand, however, churches where Christ is not the center are typically used as platforms for immoral ideologues to promote their own self-interests. Take these two so-called pastors, for example, who admit to using their churches to tell people to vote for Democrat Hillary Clinton, not for the sake of faith, but in turn for cash.
How it would have transactional.
I mean, he could possibly make a check to you. You cash the check and just bring cash. Or he could make the check to a particular church. And it works out because it's a charitable donation for him because it looks like he just gave a donation to a church.
These so-called liberal activists and community organizers are really just socialists who are following Gramsci's model by using the institutions to demonize opposing ideologies on one hand, while simultaneously romanticizing human socialism on the other hand. Naturally, hostility arises as more people who fall victim to the brainwashing of Gramsci's model begin to identify their political opponents as enemies of progress. Among the conservatives and traditionalists who are the subject of liberal provocation, there are some who react with irrational viciousness, which only causes the hostility and division to escalate all the more. Socialist politicians then use the division to conquer, that is, to set themselves up as liberators and unifiers.
So just as a result of us living our daily lives, of the lower class living their daily lives, they are consenting to being ruled by the ruling class. And what's crucial for Gramsci and this process of hegemony is that this is never ending. This is an ongoing process that is happening every second of every day of every person's living life. As they work, as they go to school, as they go to church, as they consume the media, as they do all of these things, they are consenting to being ruled by the ruling class. It's important here to point out the difference between consent and coercion, because oftentimes these sort of, when we imagine ideology and the working class comes to adopt to the ideas of the ruling class, we sort of view it as it being imposed on them through force. And the Gramscian theory of hegemony, it's crucial to point out that this isn't coercion, this is consent. That it's not as if the ruling class is using their military to impose these values and ideas on the lower class. They're using consent. So they're not using violence, which would be coercion. It's much more subtle than that. And it's voluntary on the part of the working class. In fact, there's not much opposition on their part to these ideas. He talks about also the importance of the fight takes place at the ideological level. Hegemony is the battle. And the battle is whose ideas become widely accepted in society. So for Gramsci, the working class must enter into that ideological battle, must enter into the hegemonic process so that their ideas can become more powerful than the ideas of the ruling class. And like I said, this is a never-ending process. He calls them subaltern, is an important term for Gramscian theory. The subaltern classes must take social power, ideological power, normative power. They must enter into this battleground.
So Cuba went the traditional route when it comes to Marxism. The leaders, they believed in it, so they pushed it on the people. And the idea is you're going to teach this ideology and the people will wake up and recognize, and they're going to say this is the best thing for us. So it was the traditional way of going after it, getting the leaders to believe in it, and they're gonna project it onto the people. In America, we're doing it a little bit differently. We're starting from the bottom and working our way top, it's a longer process, but it's a lot scarier. So they've gotten into, obviously, media, schools, and slowly they're just pushing it on us, and we didn't even know it until now. In the last couple of years, it's right in front of us this whole time. You don't want communism. You don't want this socialism. This is what destroys countries and lives. So I saw how the media played it. They churn in. They say like, you know, communism. It's not even an issue in America. Things like that, and they kind of put a lot of pressure on her. And I actually felt bad for her. I was like, she should be able to say that as much as she wants, and pretty much everybody should. So with that being said, I said I was actually just gonna say the same thing she said, but the issue is it's the way they play with words. So you say communism, they say, well, we're not really talking about communism. We're talking about socialism. And you say socialism, they say, well, it's not that kind of socialism. It's this. And I just said Marxism. It covers it all. The only difference between these is one of them is a slower poison that's going to kill you later on, and one of them just kills you fast. The other one kills you faster. So I think we got to make sure we start calling it just Marxism, and it's all one. You don't get to say, no, it's this. You don't get to say it's all the same thing.
Right. I mean, Karl Marx wrote a book, and this is Marxist ideology. He was talking about taking a country that was capitalist, using socialism as a transitory state, and turning it into a communist state. And people don't understand those steps. And you are so correct that if you start with talking about Marxism, the ideology, right, and the thought processes, the institutions that are practicing this Marxist ideologies, people might have a better grasp of what it is we're talking about. Interesting that you say that, you know, she's from Lithuania, because there is this thing that the West, we have been blessed for so long that we don't know what socialism is. We don't know what Marxism is. And people come here from the East and they're like, are you crazy? Do you understand the cancer that we are talking about? You're from Iran.
Yeah. My wife is Vietnamese, so her parents are from Vietnam, and they ran away from Marxism. They ran away from that, and they told me the stories. Her father basically came on a boat, and he would tell us like 9 out of 10 didn't make it. He was one of the 10 boats that did make it. So there's that. And then the stories her mom would tell me about how they got out of the house last minute. If they had stayed an extra day, they would be in a camp, or they'd be in prison, or whatever it was. So I hear those stories. And then in my country, the Ayatollah came and they promised all these free things. And they said, just let us take over and we're going to do all this stuff for you. And they made the government God. And it's the same, it's no different. It's Marxist ideology. You make government number one and people give up their rights. And from there, we're going to have vast improvement and prosperity and all that. And that it never comes because people don't realize the people who fight capitalism right now, and they say, oh, this big corporation, this big corporation has a little bit of power, because at the end of the day, you could say, I'm not going to buy from you. And so you kill its power. The government, once it takes power, nobody takes that away. You don't take it. If it's gained freely, it'll be taken back in blood. That's the only way you get away from communism. Wow. Only way you're going to get it back is in blood. And it's been over and over. It's proven. That's historical. You can see it in history.
I want to thank my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. That's number one. Hey, calm down. Calm down. Number two, I want to dedicate this fight to all the people who've been hurt by Marxist ideologies. There are millions of you, and I know it. And it's just a fight. I know it's not much, but I want you to know that I love you, and I understand.
Events in the United States, I felt morally obliged to shed light on a very similar chain of events that took place in my country during the 90s. The cause of those events was the same: a constantly re-emerging ultimate evil, nihilistic, non-theistic religion/cult that caused hundreds of millions of deaths in the 20th century and countless suffering. Now, proponents of that religion want to run the experiment once again, and in that experiment, you, people of America, will be lab mice. Not so long ago, I was a lab mouse of dictators in my country. That country was Yugoslavia. Rather than giving you lessons about history of my country, I want to give you the timeline of the events which led to an extremely bloody war and dissolution of Yugoslavian Federacy. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked the victory of the free world over tyrannical monstrosity of communism across the Europe. However, Yugoslav communists didn't feel like letting go of their precious powers. Since the climate in Europe was extremely anti-communist at the time, they knew they needed a new strategy, an ideology that would seduce the masses and keep the power in their hands. So they come up with a very clever idea: to rebrand the communism in Yugoslavia and to change its name into socialism. Not any type of socialism, but a very special type, the National Socialism. Sounds familiar? The playbook they used to progress with their agenda was already tested in Nazi Germany. To establish National Socialism, you must first install hatred in people. In order to create genocidal levels of hatred, you must divide people of one country in well-defined groups. In other words, you must create tribal or groupthink. This can be achieved in different ways. You can divide people by ethnicity, by race, by religion. You can let your imagination go wild. Since Yugoslavs were white and practically indistinguishable among themselves, the only card they could play was the religion card. Yugoslavia was very mixed religion-wise, and we had Orthodox Christian Serbs, Catholic Croats and Slovenes, and Muslim Bosnians. A perfect starting position. In the next phase, you must start making such social policies so terrible that will inevitably lead to the countless individual disadvantages. When the consequences of such government policies become obvious, you must start claiming that the cause of those inequalities is nothing but discrimination and hatred of one group towards another, and naturally, you must start screaming that those inequalities must be corrected by favoring the oppressed, discriminated group over the oppressor group. Once the groups are formed and well-defined, it's needless to say that all the mainstream media in Yugoslavia were government-controlled and were fueling the narrative about mutual discrimination and hatred relentlessly. Needless to say that all the mainstream media in Yugoslavia were government-controlled and were fueling the narrative about mutual discrimination and hatred relentlessly. The growing fear and feeling of insecurity destroyed relationships, marriages, friendships. People started retreating and isolating within their own groups because they didn't feel safe anymore with the individuals of the other group. All of a sudden, staged and very well organized mass protests started all over the country. Protests against the oppression and killing of one group by another. At first, those protests were peaceful, but soon enough, rioting and burning started. In the next phase, the tipping point with no return was reached. People started erecting barricades at the entrance of their cities, their neighborhoods, even on highways and roads. Barricades were guarded with armed civilians. Each and every attempt of the law enforcement to remove barricades and to de-escalate the situation was in vain, since they would be ambushed and killed, because they were clueless about who was the perpetrator and who was the victim. Simply because there were perpetrators and victims on both sides. In the final stages, even the army was attacked during the negotiated retreat, and 50 or 100 soldiers were killed. And just like that, Yugoslavia found itself in a civil war. City against city, village against village, family against family, and so on until the whole territories became cleaned of the members of the enemy group. Genocide, ethnic cleansing, relocation of hundreds of thousands of people were everyday news. It lasted 4 years. 100,000 people died. Some 500,000 were displaced. Those people lost everything. Yugoslavia was drowned in the bloods of thousands of innocent people and destroyed forever. You might wonder how we let that happen. How could we let things get so much out of control? That was because we didn't realize who were the real enemies, the enemies of the Yugoslav people as a whole. Instead, we were brainwashed into buying the story that we, the people, are the enemies of each other. I hope you have realized by now that your true enemies are not your fellow Americans. The ones who are, they want you to hate each other and to kill each other, while they're taking away your constitutional rights, your freedoms and your country, your heritage, your way of life and the future of your children.
On July 19, 1928, Gramsci arrived at Turi to become prisoner number 7047.
For half an hour, they went through all the moves, one after another. The weapons were simple. Spoons rubbed against a wall to leave whitewash marks on clothing. Sicilians against Apulians, Apulians against Calabrians. A grandiose, unforgettable scene, the revelation of a complex underworld with its own passions, points of view, code of honor, and cast iron hierarchy. Now you know how I spend my time when I'm not reading. I ponder all these things, analyze them minutely until my head spins. Everything that happens around me, everything that I'm able to see, becomes of exceptional interest. I keep myself under control, of course, so that I don't succumb to that monomania characteristic of prison psychology.
In November 1933, Gramsci learned that he was to be transferred from Turi to a private clinic where, though still under surveillance, he would at least have better medical attention. He had already filled 21 notebooks, the equivalent of over 1,000 printed pages, with essays and sketches of essays on history, Marxist philosophy, language, literature, social structures, and popular culture. In his own phrase, everything that concerns people. His jailers regarded his writing cynically, as a kind of harmless pastime. Gramsci intended it für ewig, for always,